Welcome to Black Right Stories. There are certain kinds of knowledge that become dangerous the moment they leave the shadows. Knowledge that once possessed transforms the bearer into something else entirely. Someone who sees possibilities where others see only routine, who understands that power doesn't always announce itself with noise and force. In the autumn of 1841 in Madison County, Mississippi, there lived a woman whose knowledge made her the most feared person on the Riverside estate, though few would ever dare speak this truth aloud. Her name was Hannah, and she had spent 23 years in the plantation kitchen, learning secrets that went far beyond the preparation of meals. The kitchen stood separate from the main house, a deliberate distance that the plantation owner, Edward Collier, had always insisted upon. Fire hazards, he would explain to visitors. But those who worked in that kitchen understood a different truth. It was a kingdom unto itself, and Hannah ruled it with absolute precision. She knew every poison that grew on the property, not because she had studied them with malicious intent, but because the knowledge had accumulated slowly, inevitably through years of careful observation, and whispered warnings passed between those who worked the land. Which mushrooms caused violent sickness, which berries stopped the heart within hours, which seeds, when crushed into powder, could mimic the symptoms of natural illness so perfectly that no physician would question the diagnosis. The white oleander that grew beside the garden path, the Jason weed hidden among the cotton rows, the castor beans cultivated for their oil, the fox glove that bloomed purple and deadly in the medicinal garden Mrs. Collier attended with such pride. Hannah knew them all. She had learned their properties not from books she couldn't read, but from experience earned through tragedy and survival. She had watched a child die after eating nightshade berries, mistaking them for wild grapes. She had seen a field hand collapse after handling water hemlock while clearing irrigation ditches. She had observed the careful measurements Mrs. Collier used when preparing her tonics and tinctures, understanding through repetition which plants healed and which merely masked suffering before delivering death. This knowledge had become Hannah's insurance, though she had never consciously thought of it that way. In a world where she possessed nothing, where even her own body belonged to another, this information represented a form of currency she kept hidden, never spending, always aware of its presence like a coin pressed against her palm. The Riverside Plantation encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of rich bottomland along the Pearl River. Cotton dominated the fields, though Edward Collier had recently invested in an experimental sugar operation. Convinced he could compete with the Louisiana estates, despite warnings from neighboring planters, 87 people lived and worked on the property, their lives dictated by the rhythms of cultivation and harvest, by the temperaments of the Collier family, by the brutal mathematics of profit and loss that reduced human beings to ledger entries. Hannah's position in the kitchen afforded her certain protections. She was too valuable to risk in the fields, too skilled to replace easily. The Collers had purchased her at auction in Natchez when she was 14, after the previous cook had died of fever. The auctioneer had emphasized her training under a French-influenced household in New Orleans, though this was an exaggeration. She had merely worked in the scullery of such a house, learning through observation rather than instruction. But Hannah possessed something more valuable than formal training, an intuitive understanding of flavors, temperatures, and timing that transformed even simple ingredients into dishes that won praise from the Collier's guests. Edward Collier took pride in his table, using elaborate dinners to cultivate relationships with factors, merchants, and politicians whose favor he required. Hannah's abilities served his ambitions, which meant she was fed better than others, allowed to sleep in a small room attached to the kitchen rather than in the quarters, and spared the worst of the physical punishments that punctuated life on the estate. This relative privilege created distance between Hannah and the others. Some resented her perceived advantages. Others understood that her position came with its own dangers, that proximity to the main house meant constant surveillance, that the standards expected of her left no room for human weakness or error. She maintained carefully calibrated relationships with everyone, respectful deference toward the Collers, professional courtesy with Thomas Barrett, the white overseer who managed the daily operations, distant but not unfriendly interactions with the house servants, practical exchanges with those who worked the gardens and livestock, trading kitchen scraps and occasional favors for the freshest produce and meat. Only with Dinah, who worked as seamstress and occasional lady's maid, to Mrs. Collier, did Hannah allow something approaching friendship. They had arrived at Riverside within months of each other, both young and terrified, both learning to navigate a world of unspoken rules and sudden violence. Over the years, they had developed a shorthand communication that required few words, able to convey warnings and reassurances with a glance or the tilt of a head. It was Dinah who first noticed something had changed in the main house. Mrs. Collier requested 3 dresses be let out. Dinah mentioned quietly one evening in late September, standing in the kitchen doorway while Hannah prepared the next day's bread dough. She said she's been retaining water, but Hannah's hands continued their rhythmic kneading, but her attention sharpened. But I heard her being sick this morning, 4th time this week. The two women's eyes met. In that silent exchange, passed an understanding of what this might mean and what consequences it might bring. Catherine Collier was 32 years old and had been married to Edward for 14 years. In that time she had given birth to 3 children, Margaret, now 12, Edward Jr., 9, and Thomas, who would have been 7 but had died of fever 3 years earlier. The loss of Thomas had devastated Catherine, plunging her into a melancholy that had lasted months, from which she had emerged changed, quieter, more distant, prone to headaches and nervous complaints. If Catherine was pregnant again, it would alter the household's dynamics in ways both obvious and subtle. It might soften Edward's increasingly short temper, giving him hope for another son. It might deepen Catherine's anxiety given her age and the memory of her loss. It might shift attention away from other matters that had been building tension in the house. Matters like Edward's frequent trips to Charleston and New Orleans, which some whispered had purposes beyond business, like the gambling debts that Thomas Barrett had mentioned to the house servants, thinking his words wouldn't travel. Like the pressure Edward had been putting on his cotton factors to advance more credit against future harvests, a dangerous practice that had ruined other planters. Hannah had learned to recognize patterns, to sense when instability threatened to erupt into crisis. The Collier household had been moving towards some kind of breaking point for months, like storm clouds gathering on a humid afternoon. A pregnancy might diffuse that tension, or it might accelerate it. She couldn't yet tell which. "I'll make her ginger tea," Hannah said finally, "the kind that settles the stomach." Dinah nodded, understanding this response for what it was. An acknowledgement of the information, a commitment to careful observation, a promise to talk more when circumstances allowed. After Dinah left, Hannah continued working the dough with mechanical precision, while her mind ranged over everything she knew about the household's current state. She had developed the habit of collecting information the way she collected herbs, carefully, systematically storing each piece away for potential future use, even when she couldn't yet see how it might be applied. She knew that Edward had argued with his brother Charles over money matters during Charles's visit last month. She knew that Margaret had been caught reading abolitionist literature smuggled in by the tutor Edward had hired, causing a scandal that resulted in the tutor's immediate dismissal. She knew that Edward Jr. had developed a cruel streak, tormenting the housecats and once attempting to burn a nest of baby mice alive until Catherine had stopped him. She knew that Thomas Barrett had started drinking more heavily, his morning rounds increasingly erratic. And she knew that over the past 6 months, 3 people on the estate had died under circumstances that, while not impossible, seemed unlikely. The first had been old Samuel, who had been past 70 and suffered from a weak heart. He had collapsed in the fields on a brutally hot day in June. The physician who examined him had declared it apoplexy, entirely expected given Samuel's age and the temperature. The second had been 19-year-old Ruth, who had been pregnant and begun bleeding heavily one night in July. She had died before morning. The same physician had concluded it was a miscarriage gone wrong, a tragedy but not uncommon. The third had been Jonas, one of the field drivers who worked under Thomas Barrett's supervision. He had complained of severe stomach pain after the midday meal in August, vomited repeatedly, and died that same evening. The physician had suggested food poisoning, perhaps spoiled meat in the heat. 3 deaths in 3 months on an estate of fewer than 90 people. Perhaps it meant nothing. Death was common enough, claiming young and old without pattern or mercy. But something about the timing bothered Hannah, a dissonance she couldn't quite name. She had cooked the meal that Jonas ate before he died. The pork had been fresh, butchered that morning. The vegetables had come from the garden, no different from what she'd served dozens of times before. She had tasted everything herself before sending it to the fields, as she always did. Nothing had been wrong with that food. So why had Jonas died? The question haunted her through the following days as she went about her routine, rising before dawn to start the kitchen fire, preparing the simple breakfast of cornmeal mush that would be distributed to those working the fields, beginning the more elaborate preparations for the main house meals, the hot breads and preserved fruits and carefully seasoned meats that Edward demanded for his table. She moved through these tasks with the efficiency of long practice, her hands working while her mind wandered through darker territory. She found herself studying the Collier family with new attention during the meals she served, noting details she had previously dismissed as routine household tensions. The way Edward barely looked at Catherine during breakfast, his attention fixed on the newspaper or his account books, the way Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. How she had started wearing gloves even inside the house as if trying to hide something. The way Margaret watched her parents with an expression Hannah couldn't quite interpret, not childish ignorance, but something older, more knowing, almost calculating. And Edward Jr., who had started spending time in the kitchen, ostensibly fascinated by the cooking process, but asking questions that made Hannah uncomfortable. "Do you ever make mistakes?" he had asked one afternoon, watching her chop vegetables with rapid precision. "Put in the wrong ingredient?" "No, Master Edward," Hannah had replied carefully. "I'm very careful with everything I prepare." "But what if you did? What if you mixed up sugar and salt or used the wrong herb?" "That wouldn't happen, Master Edward. I know every ingredient in this kitchen, every single one." His eyes had gleamed with something Hannah recognized as dangerous curiosity. "Even the things in Mother's still room, the medicine plants she keeps." Hannah had set down her knife, giving him her full attention. "I only use what belongs in the kitchen, Master Edward. Your mother's medicines are her concern, not mine." He had seemed disappointed by this answer, lingering a few more minutes before wandering away. But the exchange had left Hannah unsettled, adding another piece to the puzzle she was unconsciously assembling. That evening, after the dinner service had been completed and the main house had settled into lamplight and quiet routine, Hannah made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved the key she wasn't supposed to have, a duplicate she had made years ago by pressing the original into soft wax, then having the blacksmith create a copy in exchange for extra portions and keeping certain things to himself. She unlocked Mrs. Collier's still room. The space was small and organized with meticulous care, shelves lined with bottles and jars labeled, in Catherine's careful hand, lavender for nerves, chamomile for sleep, willow bark for pain, digitalis from the foxglove used in tiny amounts for heart complaints, belladonna for stomach cramps measured in drops so dilute they were barely present. All the medicines were accounted for, their levels appearing normal for household use. But there on the bottom shelf, hidden behind larger containers, Hannah found something that made her blood run cold. A jar labeled arsenic for rats, its contents reduced by nearly half since she had last glimpsed it months ago, during one of Mrs. Collier's occasional requests for Hannah to fetch something from the room. Arsenic, the rat poison that in small doses administered over time could cause symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness: stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, death. Hannah stood frozen in that still room, holding the jar with trembling hands, understanding with terrible clarity that she had just crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The knowledge she carried had always been theoretical, defensive, things she knew in order to protect herself from accidental harm. But now she was standing in a locked room, holding evidence of something far more sinister, forced to confront possibilities that turned her stomach even as her mind raced through the implications. Who had been using the arsenic? Who had access to this room besides Catherine? What if the 3 deaths hadn't been coincidental after all? What if someone in the main house had been killing people? And what if they knew that Hannah had figured it out? She replaced the jar exactly as she had found it, locked the still room, and returned to her small room in the kitchen building. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, she lay in darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the estate settling around her, understanding that she now possessed the most dangerous kind of knowledge, truth about murder, without any safe way to speak it. The morning after her discovery, Hannah moved through her duties with exaggerated normalcy, terrified that any deviation from routine might betray what she knew. Her hands prepared food with their usual efficiency, but her mind worked feverishly, examining the past months from this new, terrible perspective. If someone had been using arsenic to kill, they had been clever about it. The deaths had been spaced out, affecting different types of people. An elderly man, a young woman, a strong field hand. Nothing to suggest a pattern to anyone not looking for one. And arsenic, she knew from overheard conversations between Catherine and visiting ladies discussing pest control, was nearly impossible to detect after death. Physicians would see the symptoms and conclude natural causes, never thinking to suspect murder, but who would have motive to kill Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas? What connected 3 people from different parts of the plantation hierarchy? Hannah had learned over the years that information flowed through the estate along invisible channels, carried by those whose presence was so constant they became nearly invisible themselves. House servants heard conversations the callers forgot they were having. Field workers observed interactions during the overseer's rounds. Children repeated things without understanding their significance. If Hannah positioned herself carefully at these intersection points, she could map the estate's true dynamics beneath its surface appearance. She started by approaching Marcus, who worked as stable hand and thus had access to conversations that took place during arrivals and departures when people's guards were down. "Marcus," she said quietly, catching him as he brought fresh water to the kitchen. "I've been thinking about Jonas. Did he seem troubled before he died, fighting with anyone?" Marcus paused, his expression becoming guarded. People had learned to be careful when discussing the dead, particularly when their deaths might reflect poorly on the estate's management. But he and Hannah had known each other for years, long enough that he trusted her not to use information carelessly. "Not fighting exactly," he said slowly. But he'd been complaining to Thomas Barrett about the field assignments, thought Barrett was playing favorites, giving easier work to some while running others harder. Did Barrett change anything after Jonas complained? Made it worse. Gave Jonas the worst sections, the land with most stumps to clear. It was like he was punishing him. Marcus's face tightened, but Jonas was strong, could handle hard work. What he couldn't handle was, he trailed off, glancing toward the main house. "What?" Hannah pressed. "There were rumors," Marcus said finally, his voice dropping even lower, "about Jonas and one of the house girls, about them being caught together somewhere they shouldn't have been, about Mr. Keir being furious." The implication hung heavy between them. Such situations rarely ended well for those involved. If Edward had discovered a liaison between Jonas and one of the house servants, particularly if it had been consensual, it would have been seen as theft of his property's time and reproductive potential. The usual response would be swift, and public punishment meant to discourage others. But there had been no public punishment. Jonas had simply died suddenly and painfully, his death attributed to bad meat. "Which house girl?" Hannah asked. Marcus shook his head. "Don't know if it was true, just rumors." But the next day, Hannah noticed something she had missed before. 16-year-old Lily, who worked primarily as Catherine's personal maid, had been given additional outdoor duties, working in the vegetab, the garden, hauling water, tasks that kept her visible and supervised rather than inside the house, where private moments might be possible. It was the kind of reassignment that looked like normal work distribution, but functioned as punishment and control. Hannah found Lily alone in the garden late one afternoon, using the pretense of selecting herbs for that evening's meal to position herself nearby. She said nothing at first, simply working in parallel, allowing her presence to become comfortable before attempting conversation. Finally, Lily spoke first. "You knew Jonas." It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded, continuing to examine mint leaves. "Did he say anything to you?" Lily's voice was barely audible. "Before he died." "No," Hannah said truthfully. "But I remember him as a good person, someone who tried to do right by others." Lily's hands stilled in the dirt. He was he. She paused, wrestling with something. "We were going to run." He had been saving money from selling carved wood pieces to some of the hands, had almost enough to buy supplies. "We were going to try for Ohio, had heard about a route through Tennessee." Hannah's chest tightened. The escape attempt would have been nearly impossible, discovered within days and punished with savage certainty. But she understood the desperation that drove such plans, the calculation that even slim chances of freedom might be worth risking everything. "When were you planning to go?" "August. Right after the lay-by, when everyone's exhausted and discipline gets looser." Lily's voice wavered. "Then Jonas got sick. Died so fast. And you think it wasn't natural?" Hannah finished quietly. Lily's silence was answer enough. Hannah returned to the kitchen with her herbs and a deepening sense of dread. If Jonas had been killed to prevent an escape attempt, it suggested that someone had known about the plan. But how? Had Jonas confided in the wrong person? Had he and Lily been overheard during one of their clandestine meetings? That night, she questioned Dina about Jonas and Lily, choosing her words carefully. "I saw Lily crying in the garden today," Hannah said, while Dina helped clean after dinner. "She's still grieving Jonas." Dina glanced toward the main house before responding. "Mrs. Collier mentioned something about it to Mr. Collier last month. I was adjusting her dress when he came into the room. She said she'd seen Lily slipping out at odd hours, thought maybe she was meeting someone. Asked him to look into it." "What did he say?" "That he would handle it." Dinah's expression was troubled. This was maybe 2 days before Jonas died. The timeline aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. If Edward had discovered the relationship and the escape plan, Jonas's death made terrible sense, not as punishment, but as prevention, disguised as natural illness to avoid the questions and attention that a public execution might bring from neighbors or authorities. But this still left the other 2 deaths unexplained. What had Samuel and Ruth done to merit murder, or were they killed for different reasons entirely? Hannah spent the following week in a state of hypervigilance, observing everything while trying to appear normally occupied. She noticed that Catherine had indeed stopped vomiting in the mornings, confirming the pregnancy. Edward's mood had improved slightly, though he still spent long hours in his study, reviewing account books with expressions that suggested the numbers weren't cooperating with his wishes. Margaret had become more withdrawn, spending hours in her room reading when she wasn't helping Catherine with household management tasks. Edward Jr. continued his disturbing interests, recently fascinated by the butchering process, and asking Hannah detailed questions about anatomy that she deflected away, the vague non-answers. And Thomas Barrett had started appearing at the kitchen door more frequently, sometimes asking for coffee, sometimes just standing there watching Hannah work with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're a clever woman," he said one afternoon, startling her. She hadn't heard him approach. Very attentive to details, Hannah kept her focus on the vegetables she was preparing. "Just trying to do my work properly, Mr. Barrett. I'm sure you are." He didn't move from the doorway. "Noticed you've been asking questions lately about Jonas, about others." Curiosity. Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady, just trying to understand what happened. "Jonas ate food I prepared. When someone dies after eating my cooking, I need to know it wasn't something I did wrong. The physician said it was spoiled meat. The meat wasn't spoiled. I checked it carefully like I always do." Barrett was quiet for a long moment. Maybe he ate something else, something not from your kitchen. Hannah finally looked up, meeting his eyes. What she saw there made her blood run cold. A kind of calculation, an assessment of threat level, a decision being made in real time about how much danger she represented. "Maybe," she agreed, carefully, returning to her work. Barrett lingered another moment before leaving, but Hannah knew the conversation had been a warning disguised as casual inquiry. She was being watched. Her questions had been noticed. She needed to be more careful or become the next convenient death. That evening, she finally sought out Josiah, the oldest person on the estate at 73. He had been at Riverside longer than anyone, purchased by Edward's father 40 years ago, and his age had earned him a kind of informal historian status. People went to Josiah when they needed to understand the estate's deeper patterns, its unspoken rules, its dangerous currents. She found him, sitting outside his cabin carving a piece of wood into a bird shape, the same craft Jonas had learned from him. "Hannah," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Don't often see you away from the kitchen after dark. Had to stretch my legs." She settled onto a nearby stump, watching his gnarled hands work the wood with surprising deftness. "Josiah, can I ask you something? Can't promise I'll answer, but you can ask. Have people died strangely on this estate before? Deaths that seemed wrong somehow?" His hands stilled. "That's a dangerous question." "I know, but I need to understand." Josiah was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he wouldn't respond. Then, slowly, he resumed carving, his words coming measured and careful. "Mr. Calia's father, the old master, he ran this place different, firm but consistent. You knew where you stood when he died 8 years back. Young Edward inherited. Things changed. How Edward's got ambitions bigger than his means. Wants to be one of the great planters. Wants political influence. Wants respect from men who see him as small-time. That kind of wanting makes a man take risks, and when risks don't pay off, makes him desperate. What kind of risks? Expansion he couldn't afford? That sugar operation, it's bleeding money? The cotton market's been uncertain? He's borrowed against future harvests. Made promises to factors he might not be able to keep. Josiah's knife peeled another thin curl of wood. Desperate men do desperate things. You think the deaths are connected to his financial problems? Didn't say that. Said desperate men do desperate things. He finally looked at her directly. "But I'll tell you this. Samuel was the only one left who remembered when Mr. Collier's father wrote his will, and that will had some provisions about what would happen if Edward couldn't maintain the estate properly." Hannah's breath caught. "What provisions?" "Don't know exactly, but I know Edward had been asking Samuel questions about it last year, and Samuel, he had a memory like a vault, could recite conversations from decades past, word for word." "What about Ruth?" "Ruth worked in the house for a while before she got pregnant. Worked directly under Mrs. Collier, helping with household accounts. She was good with numbers, could read and cipher better than most. Mrs. Collier trusted her with private matters." The pieces were assembling into a pattern that made Hannah's skin prickle. Samuel, who knew about inheritance provisions. Ruth, who had access to financial information. Jonas, who was planning to escape with Lily, who served as Catherine's personal maid and would have been privy to intimate household secrets. 3 people who knew things, 3 people who died suddenly of causes that could be explained away as natural or accidental. "Josiah," Hannah said slowly, "if someone wanted to kill people quietly on an estate like this, how would they do it?" His hands stopped moving again. When he spoke, his voice carried a warning. "A smart person wouldn't ask questions like that. A smart person would keep their head down and their mouth shut. But if they had to ask," he set down his carving, meeting her eyes with an intensity that seemed to look straight through her, "then I'd say that person had better be very sure they could protect themselves. Because once you start pulling on threads like these, either you pull the whole thing apart or it wraps around your neck. I'm already in it, Josiah. I just need to understand how deep." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Poison's the easiest. Doesn't leave marks. Can mimic natural illness if done right. Problem is getting access to it and knowing how to use it without getting caught. Who would have that access? Mrs. Collier keeps all the medicines and rat poison locked in her still room. Only she has the key." He paused significantly. "Far as anyone knows." Hannah felt the weight of her stolen key in her pocket, as if it had suddenly become burning metal. And who would know how to use them properly? someone educated, someone who'd been taught about herbs and medicines, someone like Mrs. Collier, who came from a family that prided itself on household medicine knowledge. The implication struck Hannah like cold water. She had been assuming Edward was behind the deaths. But what if it was Catherine? What if the mistress of the house, with her medicines and her melancholy and her trembling hands, was systematically removing threats to the household's stability? But that raised new questions. Why would Catherine kill Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas? What threat did they pose to her? Unless she was protecting Edward, unless she knew about his financial desperation, his secrets, his vulnerabilities, and was eliminating anyone who might expose him or complicate his efforts to solve his problems. Or unless Catherine had her own secrets, her own desperate need for control in a life where she had so little power. Hannah thanked Josiah and made her way back to the kitchen, her mind spinning with possibilities. She had entered this investigation thinking she was looking for a single poisoner with clear motives. Instead, she was uncovering a web of secrets, financial pressure, and multiple people with access and potential reasons to kill. And she was running out of time to stay invisible. Thomas Barrett's warning had been clear. Someone knew she was asking questions. Someone was watching her. If she didn't figure out who was behind the death soon, she might become the fourth victim. The next morning brought new complications. Catherine requested Hannah's presence in the main house, an unusual summons that immediately set every nerve on edge. Hannah found Catherine in the small sit-in room she used for morning correspondence, sitting by the window with her hands folded in her lap. She looked pale and tired, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she wasn't sleeping well. "Hannah," Catherine said without preamble, "I need to discuss something delicate with you." "Yes, ma'am." "I've been hearing reports that you've been asking questions about certain unfortunate events on the estate. The deaths of Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas." Hannah's mouth went dry, but she kept her expression neutral. "I was concerned, ma'am. Jonas died after eating a meal I prepared. I wanted to make sure there wasn't something wrong with my cooking. The physician confirmed it was spoiled meat, not your preparation." "Yes, ma'am. But the meat wasn't spoiled when I cooked it. I was worried there might be something else I missed." Catherine studied her with eyes that seemed to see more than Hannah was comfortable with. "Your dedication to your responsibilities is noted. However, I need you to understand that asking questions about such matters can cause unnecessary distress. People talk, rumors spread, and the last thing this household needs is speculation about improper circumstances. I understand, Mom." "Do you?" Catherine's voice sharpened slightly. "Because I'm not sure you understand your position here, Hannah. You're very good at your work. The meals you prepare are excellent, and you've served this family well for many years. But that service depends on discretion, on knowing what questions to ask and which ones to leave unspoken." It was a threat wrapped in courtesy, unmistakable in its intent. "I understand completely, ma'am," Hannah said quietly. "I won't ask any more questions." "Good." Catherine's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained hard. "I'm glad we understand each other. You may return to your duties." Hannah left the sitting room with her heart pounding so hard she thought Catherine must have heard it. The message had been clear. Stop investigating or face consequences. But the very fact that Catherine had felt the need to deliver that warning personally suggested Hannah had touched something important, something dangerous enough to warrant direct intervention. She had two choices now. She could obey Catherine's warning, stop asking questions, and hope that whoever was killing people didn't decide she knew too much to live. Or she could continue investigating more carefully this time and try to protect herself by gathering enough evidence that her death would raise uncomfortable questions. Neither option was safe, but one left her completely vulnerable to someone else's choices, while the other gave her at least the illusion of agency. Hannah chose the second option, knowing it might kill her. The days following Catherine's warning were among the most difficult of Hannah's life. She maintained absolute normalcy in her visible behavior, executing her kitchen duties with mechanical perfection, while her mind worked constantly on the impossible problem of how to protect herself from an enemy she couldn't openly acknowledge. She needed evidence, but couldn't risk being caught gathering it. She needed allies, but couldn't trust anyone completely, not when the killer might be Catherine, Edward, Barrett, or someone else entirely who might inform on her for favor or safety. So, she worked with what she had: observation, patience, and knowledge of the plantation's rhythms that came from 23 years of paying attention. She watched Catherine carefully during meal services, noting that the mistress had started taking her meals in her room more frequently, citing morning sickness and fatigue. But Hannah noticed other details. The way Catherine's hands had stopped trembling, suggesting either the pregnancy was stabilizing her nerves or something else had changed. The way she had started spending more time in the garden, particularly near the medicinal plants. She watched Edward, who had become increasingly irritable, snapping at his children and house servants over minor infractions. His study sessions with account books stretched later into the night, and she twice saw Thomas Barrett leaving the study, looking troubled after extended private conversations. She watched Edward Jr., whose fascination with death had progressed from questions to actions. He had killed a cat. Everyone knew, though no one spoke of it, claiming it had attacked him, though the animal had been too mutilated for that explanation to hold credibility. Margaret had found the body and reported it to Catherine with trembling hands. But Catherine had merely instructed the boy to be more careful and said nothing to Edward. And she watched Thomas Barrett, who had developed an unsettling habit of appearing wherever Hannah was working, never quite approaching her directly, but always present, always watching, like a hunter, positioning himself for an eventual strike. But her most important observation came 2 weeks after Catherine's warning, when Hannah noticed something that changed her entire understanding of the situation. She was preparing vegetables early one morning when Lily came to the kitchen door sent by Catherine to request a specific herbal tea blend for her nausea. As Hannah prepared the mixture, she noticed how thin Lily had become, how the girl's hands shook slightly as she accepted the teapot. "Are you well, Lily?" Hannah asked quietly. The girl's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. "I'm fine, Miss Hannah." "You don't look fine." Lily glanced over her shoulder, verifying they were alone. Then, in a voice barely louder than breath, she whispered, "I'm scared." Hannah's heart tightened. Scared of what? Lily's eyes darted toward the main house. "I can't say, but if something happens to me, you need to know." Footsteps echoed across the porch. She froze. "I have to go." And just like that, she was gone, vanishing into the darkness before Hannah could stop her. But the fear in Lily's voice lingered all day, clinging to Hannah's thoughts like smoke. It wasn't vague fear. It wasn't imagination. Lily was afraid of something real, something close, something already moving. And she had tried to warn her. That night, Hannah crossed a line she could never uncross. She would enter the main house. After midnight, when even Edward's lamp had gone dark and the plantation slept under a heavy, breathless sky, she moved. With the stolen key trembling in her hand, she slipped through the kitchen door and into the silence. She had walked these floors 1,000 times, carrying trays and keeping her eyes down. But tonight was different. Tonight, she did not belong. The house felt alive in the darkness. The wood groaned beneath her careful steps. The walls seemed to breathe. Every faint creak made her pulse hammer against her ribs. Every shadow felt like it was watching. If she were discovered, the consequences would be brutal. Whipping, sale, disappearance, or worse. But fear was no longer stronger than the truth she needed, because Hannah had begun to understand something terrifying. The Collier family was hiding secrets. And secrets on this plantation did not stay buried forever. If you want to uncover what Hannah finds inside that house, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chapter of this dark historical mystery.